Okay, let's unpack this. I want you to take a second and just imagine having a mind that doesn't just merely survive stress, but actually uses it as fuel.
Like a completely unbeatable mind.
Exactly, an unbeatable mind. And I know that phrase sounds like a marketing slogan.
Right, it really does.
It conjures up images of someone who never feels fear, never experiences anxiety, and essentially operates like a sociopathic robot when the pressure is on.
Which is physically impossible.
Right. Because let's be real, we are all human. We feel the sting of failure. We feel the weight of expectations. So what if an unbeatable mind isn't a mind that is devoid of fear, but rather a mind that is so well trained, so incredibly resilient, that it actually transforms those inevitable roadblocks into launch pads?
That is the core of it, yes.
That is exactly what we're getting into today. Welcome to the deep dive.
Today, we are immersing ourselves in the fascinating concepts laid out in the book Mental Training by Addison Bell, looking specifically at how we can fundamentally alter our relationship with adversity. And it is a genuinely transformative way of looking at human psychology. What stands out immediately when you look at the research compiled here is the complete dismantling of the myth that mental toughness is this innate genetic gift.
Yeah, that toughness gene.
Exactly. We tend to look at elite athletes or Tier 1 military operators or stoic historical figures and assume they were simply born with a different neurological wiring, that they have a toughness gene that the rest of us just lack.
Which is super discouraging if you think about it.
It's incredibly discouraging. But the reality, borne out by extensive psychological and physiological data, is that mental toughness is a cultivated skill set. It's an architecture that you build brick by brick. And the most crucial foundational context we can provide for you today is that mental training isn't about being perfect.
It's about being prepared.
Precisely. It is not the absence of negativity or the eradication of your fears. The fight-or-flight instinct is one of our absolute oldest biological responses. Achieving a total victory over your negative emotions or your ingrained anxieties is an unrealistic and frankly impossible attack plan.
You can't just fight your own biology.
No, you can't. True mental training is about creating a supportive internal environment so that when things go wrong, and they absolutely will go wrong, you have the flexibility and the specific tools required to process that stress without shattering.
I think that's a vital distinction because so much of the self-help space pushes this toxic positivity narrative.
Oh, absolutely. The whole just think good thoughts movement.
Right, where if you just think good thoughts, bad things magically won't affect you. But this approach is deeply pragmatic. We are going to map out the specific frameworks presented in the text, exploring the 7 C's of resilience, decoding the hidden neurobiology of our habits, and learning how to practically apply the ancient Japanese concept of kintsugi to our modern lives.
It's a fantastic roadmap.
But before we get into the tactical stuff, I want to challenge a piece of terminology that gets thrown around a lot. We hear the words resilience and toughness used interchangeably all the time. But the text draws a very hard, critical distinction between the two.
It does. It actually borrows from material science to make the point, which is fascinating.
Yeah, the distinction is huge. So resilience, at its core, is an engineering term. If you talk to a structural engineer, they will tell you that resilience describes the ability of a material to absorb energy when it is deformed elastically, and then to have this energy recovered.
In simpler terms, it's the ability of the material to return to its natural shape after taking damage.
Right, after being dented or put under intense pressure. For a material to be resilient, it has to possess 2 balanced qualities: strength and flexibility.
Because strength increases the yield point, the amount of force it can take before a permanent fault occurs.
Exactly, but flexibility is what prevents it from snapping completely under sudden, immense strain. If a skyscraper only had strength but 0 flexibility, it would just snap in half during a high wind or an earthquake.
It absolutely needs to sway.
It needs to sway.
Yeah.
So in mental health terms, resilience is your psychological safety net. It is your baseline ability to bounce back, to adapt, and to recover when you are hit by trauma, grief, or unexpected stress. It is fundamentally about surviving the impact and returning to a functional baseline.
So resilience is the sway of the skyscraper. It's the suspension system in your car taking the hit from a pothole so the axle doesn't snap.
Spot on. But then we have toughness. If resilience is your baseline safety net, toughness is what happens when you decide to leave the safety net and purposely walk out onto the tightrope.
Toughness is your ability to push higher, to intentionally take on extreme challenges, and to thrive in those hostile environments.
But, and I think this is the trap a lot of high achievers fall into,
Hmm.
you cannot possess mental toughness without first establishing mental resilience.
Precisely. You can't thrive if you haven't figured out how to survive the fall. If you attempt to exhibit toughness, say, by working 100-hour weeks to launch a startup or training for an ultramarathon, without having that flexible safety net in place, you will eventually reach your yield point.
And you will snap.
You will experience catastrophic burnout. Toughness is an active, offensive posture, whereas resilience is your defensive foundation.
And this concept of absorbing damage and returning to form brings us to one of the most profound metaphors for human healing I've ever encountered, which is kintsugi.
The kintsugi metaphor is brilliant. It completely changes how you view past failures.
It really does. So for those who aren't familiar, kintsugi is the traditional Japanese art of repairing smashed pottery. Usually when we drop a bowl and it shatters, our immediate instinct is to sweep it up and throw it in the trash.
Or we try to super glue it back together so perfectly that you can't see the cracks.
Right, we want to hide the damage and pretend it never happened. But the kintsugi artist takes the exact opposite approach. When a piece of pottery breaks, they repair it using a special liquid lacquer called urushi, which is mixed with powdered gold.
The visual of kintsugi is striking because the artist deliberately accentuates the break. They literally draw attention to the trauma the object has suffered.
And the philosophy behind this finding beauty in imperfection is incredibly potent for mental training. Normally, when we look at our own cracks, our failures, or public humiliations, we view them as ugly blemishes. We expend massive amounts of psychological energy trying to hide them.
But kintsugi artists understand something profound. Because the pottery has been repaired with this highly durable lacquer, it is actually physically stronger at the glued joints than it was before it shattered.
And because no two objects ever shatter the exact same way, those golden veins map a history of survival that makes the object uniquely valuable. It transforms an ordinary bowl into a one-of-a-kind masterpiece.
It's the physical embodiment of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but making you more valuable to the world. And when we look at history, we see human beings who intuitively understood this, who poured gold into their own massive psychological cracks. Winston Churchill is a prime example highlighted in the text.
Oh, Churchill's a fascinating example. Today we view him almost as a caricature of toughness. The stoic bulldog with a cigar, the man who stood up to the Nazi war machine. But he did not start out that way.
Not at all. Churchill's early life was incredibly turbulent. He had a childhood marked by intense feelings of neglect and a desperate yearning for his parents' approval. He battled severe clinical depression his entire adult life. He famously called it his black dog.
These weren't just mild, sad days. These were deep, paralyzing, and depressive episodes.
But Churchill didn't hide from his black dog. He used those cracks. He actively built his resilience through disciplined habits, his historical writing, his painting. More importantly, when the time came, he used his own intimate battle with personal despair to understand exactly how to rally the hopes of an entire nation when reality looked utterly hopeless.
Because he knew the darkness intimately.
Exactly. It allowed him to speak to a terrified British public with a resonant empathy that a man who had never suffered simply could not have mustered. His depression was the crack. His leadership during the Blitz was the gold that filled it.
And we see a similar dynamic in the life of Helen Keller. If you look at her starting circumstances, losing both sight and hearing at 19 months old, almost anyone would categorize those as insurmountable barriers.
Catastrophic cracks that isolate a person from the world entirely. For the first few years of her life, she was trapped in a dark, silent void. She was prone to wild tantrums just out of the sheer frustration of being unable to communicate.
It's terrifying to try and conceptualize that level of isolation. But Keller possessed a fierce ambition and an unquenchable empathy. Her intense desire to connect became the gold that filled those cracks.
When Anne Sullivan finally broke through to her, spilling water into her hand, it unlocked a torrent of intellectual pursuit. She turned her profound need for connection into her greatest strength.
She became a world-renowned author, an activist, a suffragette. She utilized the unique perspective her disabilities gave her to change global perceptions.
So if we pull this back to you listening right now, the lesson here is that human beings possess an ability that traditional materials don't have. A steel beam can be resilient, it can bend and return to its shape, but it can never become more than a steel beam.
But human beings have the ability to heal and, in the process, fundamentally grow.
This raises a critical question about how we view our negative emotions and our fears. We are culturally conditioned to believe that courage is the absence of fear, that the hero's heart rate doesn't spike.
Which is biologically false.
Completely false. Courage is the ability to acknowledge the presence of fear, to feel the physiological response, the adrenaline, the cortisol, and consciously take that energy and use it to fuel your resolve. You act because your objective is more important than the fear itself. Your anxiety, your doubt, these aren't opponents to be vanquished. They are raw energy sources.
So I want you to think about your own dents and cracks for a moment. Maybe it was a massive career setback, a business venture you poured your savings into that went bankrupt, or a deeply painful breakup.
Our instinct is to view these events as permanent damage to our identity. We label ourselves as failed entrepreneurs or unlovable.
But I want to challenge you to reframe these experiences. Do not view them as permanent structural damage. View them as exceptionally expensive, hard-won diplomas from the School of Hard Knocks.
The event shattered the bowl, yes. But what is the gold you were going to use to fill the cracks? What unique empathy or hardened resolve did that failure grant you?
But finding that gold and having the steady hand to apply it requires us to first build up that baseline safety net of resilience. We have to stabilize the structure before we can repair it. And this leads us to the internal anchors that support human resilience.
The text outlines a remarkably comprehensive framework known as the 7 C's of resilience.
The 7 C's framework is brilliant because it takes this nebulous concept of resilience and breaks it down into actionable pillars. The first 5 pillars are internal: competence, confidence, character, coping, and control.
We will touch on all of them, but we really need to zero in deeply on confidence and coping, because while we treat these as purely psychological states of mind, there's a massive physiological component that we completely ignore at our own peril.
Right, if we connect this to the biological reality, coping and control are actually the most accessible pillars to build through the physical body.
We spend thousands of dollars on therapy, trying to forcefully alter our conscious thoughts, while completely ignoring our biology. It is incredibly difficult to believe in yourself psychologically when you are actively depriving your brain of the raw materials it requires to function.
Confidence is a neurological state supported by precise biological processes, and the details here are staggering. Let's talk about hydration. We all know we should drink water, but the numbers reframe why it's a mental toughness issue.
Your body is roughly 60% water, but your brain and your heart, the two organs working hardest under extreme stress, are 73% water.
And the text points out that if your body's hydration drops by just 2%, it begins to severely impair cognitive function.
It ruins focus, disrupts short-term memory, and torpedoes emotional regulation. The mechanics of that 2% drop are fascinating. When you are even mildly dehydrated, your blood volume actually decreases.
Because your blood is physically thicker.
Exactly. So your heart has to work significantly harder to pump oxygen, which elevates your baseline heart rate. This physical strain mimics the somatic symptoms of anxiety.
While simultaneously your brain starts misfiring.
The cerebrospinal fluid that cushions your brain actually decreases in volume. The text notes that a tall glass of water should be your absolute first-line coping mechanism for a sudden panic attack or brain fog.
But let me play devil's advocate here. When we hit that afternoon slump, our culturally conditioned response is to grab a massive cup of coffee or an energy drink. We want caffeine to force focus.
Which is a profound tactical error. Caffeine is a central nervous system stimulant, which masks fatigue by blocking adenosine receptors. But caffeine is also a diuretic. It signals your kidneys to expel water.
So if your brain fog is caused by a 2% hydration drop, introducing a diuretic accelerates the very dehydration causing the problem.
You are treating a fire by pouring gasoline on it. Your brain is crying out for fluid, and you are forcing it to expel more fluid, while artificially jacking up your heart rate. It exacerbates the physical symptoms of anxiety. It is the absolute antithesis of coping.
That is such a powerful reframe. Think about the last time you were sitting at your desk, overwhelmed by a complex project. Your chest was tight, your anxiety was through the roof. You probably started telling yourself you weren't smart enough for the job.
What if you weren't incapable at all? What if you were just 2% dehydrated and heavily caffeinated?
We mistake physiological distress for psychological failure all the time. And this exact same principle applies to our nutrition.
The text heavily emphasizes the psychological impact of the glycemic index, or GI. The brain is an energy hog. It runs almost exclusively on glucose.
When you consume high GI carbohydrates, white bread, sugary snacks, your body breaks them down very quickly, causing a rapid spike in blood glucose.
Your brain gets a sudden flood of energy, but your body responds by releasing a massive surge of insulin to pull that sugar out of your blood.
which leads to the inevitable aggressive crash.
Exactly. And that sudden plummet in blood sugar triggers a stress response. It releases cortisol and adrenaline. Behaviorally, this presents as unexplained irritability, sudden mood swings, and a drastic loss of focus.
You feel emotionally fragile, not because of a character flaw, but because your blood sugar is behaving like a roller coaster.
If you are trying to build emotional resilience, you need a stable metabolic foundation. Swapping high GI carbs for low GI alternatives, like sweet potatoes or complex whole grains, provides a slow, metered release of glucose. You maintain the biological capacity to maintain your confidence under pressure.
Hydration and glucose are critical, but then we arrive at the absolute bedrock of biological coping, which is sleep. Now, we know the 7 to 9 hours rule, but the research here emphasizes that the consistency of your sleep schedule is just as crucial as the duration.
The text mentions Dr. Christian Barnard, the surgeon who performed the first human heart transplant. He famously functioned on roughly 4 hours of sleep a night.
How is that physically possible without him making a fatal surgical error?
Because his schedule was rigorously, ruthlessly consistent. He went to bed and woke up at the exact same time down to the minute every single day. When you maintain a rigid schedule, you anchor your circadian rhythm. This allows your brain to optimize the sleep cycles it does get.
Because sleep isn't just passive rest, it's an active cleaning process.
Yes, during deep sleep, the brain activates the glymphatic system. It literally flushes cerebrospinal fluid through the brain tissue to clear out toxic byproducts of daytime cellular metabolism.
Including plaques associated with cognitive decline. If your sleep is highly inconsistent, your brain never efficiently engages this deep cleaning cycle.
Which perfectly explains why sleep is not a bank account. You hear people say, I'll grind on 4 hours a night and sleep 14 hours on Saturday to pay off the debt.
It's a profound misunderstanding of human physiology. You cannot retrospectively clean the brain of 5 days of toxins with one massive binge of sleep.
All that binge sleeping does is severely disrupt your circadian rhythm, making it impossible to fall asleep Sunday night. It leaves your central nervous system frayed. True coping requires the discipline of consistency.
Okay, so we've established getting our internal biological house in order, but the text also brings up a fascinating point about how we organize our external house, our immediate environment. It argues that decluttering is an active practice of building the control and confidence pillars.
It comes down to cognitive load theory. Your visual cortex is constantly scanning your environment. When your workspace is cluttered, your brain is forced to subconsciously process all those objects, evaluating if they are relevant to your current task.
It's a continuous drain on cognitive energy. The example they use is perfect. Imagine your desk, you're trying to work. But sitting next to your notebook is an old, dusty SSD hard drive that you haven't plugged in for 3 years.
Every time you reach for your pen, you have to subconsciously navigate around it. The inability to seamlessly find what you need is a massive unnecessary stressor.
By removing that dusty drive, you are curating your environment to keep only the objects that align with your current needs. You are physically creating a space that actively supports your internal psychological control.
You're validating your ability to control your circumstances.
I love that. So we've secured the internal pillars. We have a baseline of competence, confidence, character, coping, and control. Now we need to build bridges to the outside world. This brings us to the final 2 C's, connection and contribution. And we look at these through the lens of character.
Connection is not a luxury. It is a biological imperative. The author references the survivalist's rule of threes. You can survive 3 minutes without oxygen, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food.
But from a psychological standpoint, human beings can only go up to about 3 months without meaningful human contact or love before severe psychological degradation sets in.
3 months. We are highly social primates. The neurobiology of loneliness actually triggers the same pain centers in the brain as physical injury, so building a supportive community is foundational to resilience.
But it's the contribution pillar that I found absolutely brilliant here. Usually we frame contribution as self-sacrifice. You drain your own cup to fill someone else's. But the text positions contribution as a strategic life hack.
It flips the traditional paradigm. Often, we say yes to every request, even if the task deeply exhausts us. The author argues that sustainable contribution is about the accurate recognition of strengths.
If a colleague asks for help with a massive data entry task and staring at spreadsheets totally drains your cognitive reserves, you don't have to say a flat, unhelpful no.
But you shouldn't drain yourself by saying yes. Instead, you redirect them to someone in your network who genuinely loves organizing data.
It's a positive-sum game. The person gets the assistance they need, you protect your energy while acting as a valuable connector, and the person you referred gets to do work they intrinsically enjoy.
Navigating these connections gracefully requires us to deeply examine our character, which means examining the lens through which we frame our reality. How we talk to ourselves dictates how we experience the world.
This is where the text analyzes the all-or-nothing thinking trap. When we view our obligations as entirely burdensome, we build resentments that erode our resilience. We have to shift from "I must" to "I get to."
That semantic shift sounds small, but the neurological impact is massive. The text gives relatable examples. A professional wedding photographer could wake up and think, I must go take pictures for 10 hours today just to survive.
That framing feels like carrying a boulder up a hill. It releases stress hormones. Or they could actively reframe it. I get to capture the most important memories of these people's lives.
An administrative worker doing data entry could think, I must work this monotonous job until I retire. That leads to despair. Or they can shift to, I get to work a steady job that supports my family and allows me to enjoy my weekends off.
The objective reality, the hours, the paycheck remains exactly the same. But the psychological experience of that reality is entirely different.
But maintaining that gratitude is incredibly difficult when we are constantly bombarded with the successes of others. And this is a massive trap. When trying to build these connections, we inevitably fall into the trap of comparison.
There's a great quote in the text. Comparisons are odious.
They are profoundly destructive. Comparing your life to others destroys the connection and confidence pillars. Today, with social media, we aren't just comparing ourselves to our local tribe. We are exposed to the curated highlights of 8 billion people.
When you look at an influencer's perfect vacation photos, you are making a cognitive error. You are comparing your messy behind-the-scenes reality to their heavily edited highlight reel.
You have absolutely no idea what it took for them to acquire that success. That massive executive salary might come at the cost of chronic insomnia or a failing marriage.
You're measuring your starting line against their finish line, while entirely ignoring the obstacle course they ran to get there. It is profoundly disempowering.
Which means the most vital skill we can develop is the ability to dictate our own narrative. Reframing might be the most practical tool we have against the fear of failure and the paralysis of problem solving.
Reframing is arguably the most potent application of cognitive flexibility. When we hit an obstacle, our default setting is functional fixedness. We only see the problem in the exact way it initially presented itself.
Reframing is stepping back, rotating the problem, and changing the parameters of what needs to be solved.
Let's walk through the examples, starting with the space race man anecdote. The book notes this is likely an urban legend, but the core lesson is brilliant. NASA realized ballpoint pens wouldn't work in zero gravity,
So they spent millions inventing a complex, pressurized pen.
while the Soviet cosmonauts, faced with the exact same problem, simply used a wooden pencil.
It perfectly shows how the complexity of a problem depends on how you frame the objective. If you frame it as, we must engineer a pen for a vacuum, you go down a $1,000,000 rabbit hole.
But if you reframe it as, we need a way to record information on paper in space, the solution graphite on wood costs pennies.
Another great example from a Harvard Business Review case study cited in the text is the elevator problem. A property manager has tenants complaining the building's elevator is incredibly slow,
The obvious frame is, the elevator is mechanically too slow, I need to make it faster.
which requires buying a massive new motor or a whole new shaft, a multi-million-dollar expense.
So the landlord reframes the problem. The core issue isn't the mechanical velocity. The core issue is the excruciating boredom of waiting.
So instead of a new motor, he installs large floor-to-ceiling mirrors in the lobby and plays upbeat music.
People love looking at themselves in the mirror. Suddenly, the 2-minute wait feels like 30 seconds. The mechanical speed didn't change, but the perception of the wait was altered. Problem solved for a fraction of the cost.
The text also mentions the window problem. Two partners in an office are arguing. One demands the window be wide open for fresh air. The other demands it be shut because they hate the freezing wind hitting their face.
It seems like a zero-sum binary. Someone has to lose.
This is positional bargaining. Both sides have locked into a rigid position. But when you reframe the conflict to examine the underlying interests, person A needs air, person B needs to avoid a draft a solution emerges.
You walk into the adjacent room, open the window in that room, and leave the connecting door open. Fresh air circulates, but the direct draft is broken by the wall. Both needs are met perfectly without compromise.
And finally, there's the systemic approach illustrated by the animal shelter. A shelter is completely overwhelmed with pets. The traditional frame is downstream. We have too many pets. We need massive marketing to push adoptions.
But adoptions only treat the symptom. When they analyzed the intake data, they realized the vast majority of these animals were being surrendered by loving families who just couldn't afford pet food or vet care.
So they reframe the problem from how do we get rid of these pets to how do we help people keep the pets they already love? They created a free pet food pantry and subsidized vet clinics.
Infinitely cheaper, less traumatic, and preserves the well-being of the families. Reframing is a superpower. But to actively reframe problems, we have to confront the fear of failure. And our own negative self-talk is the architect of that fear.
Negative self-talk operates by constantly moving the goalposts of success. It ensures you never feel a sense of competence. You train hard and run a 5K.
But instead of celebrating, your inner critic whispers, well, it was only a 5K, you didn't run a marathon.
To combat this, the author strongly advocates for journaling. When anxieties remain trapped in your head, they are vague and utilize the brain's default mode network to loop worst-case scenarios.
Journaling forces you to translate those vague emotions into concrete language. Once a fear is explicitly written on paper, your prefrontal cortex can engage with it logically and dismantle it.
Building on that, the source offers a brilliant speculative exercise. It's a twist on worst-case scenario planning. Usually, we are terrified of the worst-case scenario. The author says, lean into it.
Sit down with your journal and explicitly write out exactly, step by step, how you could guarantee that the absolute worst possible outcome occurs.
If your goal is to build trust with a new team, and your fear is that they will despise you and you'll be fired, write down how to achieve that failure. I will aggressively interrupt them, I will lie about deadlines, I will steal credit for their work.
By actively mapping out the worst-case scenario, you accidentally create a perfect, highly actionable roadmap of exactly what not to do.
It completely demystifies the fear. Failure isn't an accident. It requires a specific set of terrible actions that you have conscious control over avoiding.
You simply look at your list and say, okay, today I will choose not to interrupt anyone. You reclaim your agency. But maintaining that agency brings us to one of the most mechanically complex aspects of mental training.
Because we spend the vast majority of our lives operating on autopilot. To build an unbeatable mind, we have to understand the neurobiology of our routines, specifically the psychology of habits.
And it comes down to biology and energy consumption. Your brain makes up only about 2% of your total body mass. Yet just to keep the lights on, it consumes a staggering 20% of your body's total energy output.
In young children, it can consume up to 60%. Conscious thought is biologically expensive. The brain must conserve energy whenever possible. Habits are the brain's evolutionary trick to save energy.
It's neurological offloading. When you perform an action repeatedly, the brain groups those actions into a single chunk.
It transfers control from the energy-intensive prefrontal cortex down into the basal ganglia, a deeper part of the brain that operates almost entirely automatically.
A habit equals a cue, followed by a routine or response, which delivers a reward. Cue, response, reward. That loop is the operating system of our lives.
And understanding that loop is the only way to comprehend the massive truth bomb the author drops. You cannot make a habit out of abstinence.
This is where sheer willpower fails almost everyone.
If you have a bad habit, say smoking when you're stressed, the cue is stress, the response is smoking, the reward is nicotine. If you try to quit cold turkey by just saying, I will stop smoking, you are using willpower to force an abstinence.
But willpower is a conscious effort from the prefrontal cortex, and that energy depletes rapidly.
You are leaving a neurological vacuum. The cue still happens. The brain still screams for the reward, but there is no response provided.
When life gets stressful, willpower evaporates and the brain defaults back to the deeply grooved neural pathway in the basal ganglia.
To successfully break a bad habit, you must hijack the loop. You must identify the old cue and deliberately attach a new, slightly familiar response that delivers a similar reward.
The emphasis on the new response being slightly familiar is key. If it's completely alien, the brain rejects it. The book gives a compelling example of a teenager who wants to break a daily habit of watching pornography.
They make a solemn promise to themselves to just stop. Willpower carries them for a week.
Until a massive emotional stress hits, they fail a midterm, or their parents announce a divorce. Willpower plummets. The established cue hits, feeling overwhelmed, getting into bed, and the brain screams for that dopamine reward to numb the stress.
The abstinence model fails completely and they relapse. So when the exact same cue hits, they must consciously replace the response with something that aligns with their values but possesses a hint of that familiar reward.
If the underlying drive was a desire for narrative or romance, the new response could be reading a steamy romance novel. It provides thematic engagement but avoids the extreme dopamine spike of the screen.
If the drive was somatic releasing physical tension, the new response could be intense Pilates or deep stretching yoga before sleep. Keep the cue, change the routine, satisfy the underlying need.
Another highly relatable example is late-night doom scrolling. The cue is getting into bed and feeling a lingering sense of loneliness. The routine is scrolling social media. The reward is a tiny drip of digital connection.
If you want to cut screen time, don't just put the phone in another room and stare at the ceiling fighting the urge. Replace the response. Keep a notepad by your bed. When the cue hits, write physical, handwritten letters to your friends.
You can photograph and text them the next morning. You are fully satisfying the underlying cue for human connection, but achieving it through tactile feedback that actively helps you wind down for sleep.
You are no longer fighting the current of the river. You are digging a new trench to redirect the water.
So think about that bad habit you beat yourself up over. Stop trying to just stop doing it. Identify the specific cue. What new, slightly familiar response can you plug into that exact same cue tonight?
Redirecting that river takes time. But as you practice, you begin to cultivate grit. And grit is what allows you to sustain this entire architecture.
The book defines grit very specifically. It's not just being stubborn. Grit equals passion plus persistence.
That formula is vital. Grit fundamentally requires deep intrinsic passion. The source uses Liam Neeson's character in the movie, taken as an example.
Oh, this is such a perfect illustration. He uses his very specific set of skills to relentlessly hunt down the kidnappers of his daughter. He exhibits terrifying world-burning grit.
But he would not have exhibited that same persistence if they had broken in and kidnapped his goldfish.
You cannot manufacture grit for an objective you don't fundamentally care about. But the text also challenges us to redefine the persistence half of the equation. We tend to view persistence as relentless, 247 effort.
To illustrate true persistence, the source uses a muscle metaphor. Constant grinding effort at the gym physically tears the muscle fibers down. It is the period of complete rest afterward that allows the body to repair those fibers, making them stronger.
True persistence is consistent, intense effort followed by intentional, structured rest.
The text also uses an agricultural analogy, crop rotation. If a farmer plants the exact same demanding crop in the same field year after year, it strips all the nutrients out of the soil.
Eventually, the soil becomes completely barren. To maintain the long-term health of the farm, you must let the field lie completely fallow for a season.
If you want to maintain your psychological grit, you must intentionally let your mind lie fallow. You must rotate your activities. Switch from highly analytical work to creative hobbies.
But how you view that necessary rest and the inevitable failures you face depends on whether you possess a fixed mindset or a growth mindset.
A person with a fixed mindset believes their abilities are static. They view any challenge as a threat to their identity. If they fail, the narrative is, I am inherently deficient.
But a person with a growth mindset fundamentally believes that abilities are plastic. Talent is just a starting point. Failure is simply an active data gathering session. When they fail, the narrative is, I am not good at this yet.
And the secret sauce to keeping that growth mindset alive is the active pursuit of novelty. Intentionally trying something entirely new forces the brain off autopilot.
It triggers the release of dopamine and brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which acts like fertilizer for the brain, physically cementing new neural pathways.
By consistently introducing novelty, you are keeping your mind highly flexible and deeply resilient.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We separated the safety net of resilience from the offensive tightrope of toughness. We mapped out the internal architecture using the 7 C's.
We learned that biological coping starts with hydration, stable blood glucose, and the consistent sleep required for glymphatic cleaning.
We unpacked the rule of threes, reframed contribution, and tackled cognitive distortions. We used journaling to map out worst-case scenarios, and we decoded the basal ganglia's habit loop to replace bad routines without relying on the myth of abstinence willpower.
And we saw how the kintsugi mindset allows us to view our failures not as trash to be hidden, but as the literal liquid gold that makes us uniquely stronger. Mental toughness is not an end state. It is a living, breathing architecture.
It is an ongoing daily practice. You are going to step out into the world and you are going to take hits. You will get dented. But you now understand the mechanics of how to bounce back.
And as we close this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final lingering question to mull over. Think about the one crack or flaw in your life you've spent years trying to hide from everyone. What if that specific flaw isn't a weakness at all, but the exact cue you need to trigger a brand new, wildly successful habit? If Kintsugi uses gold to highlight the break, what gold are you going to pour into your biggest flaw today?
That is a deeply provocative thought to leave on. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly expansive deep dive today. Keep building that resilient architecture, keep looking for the gold in the cracks, and we will see you next time.